The courthouse in downtown Atlanta stood like a monument of authority, its tall stone pillars casting long shadows over the steps below. Reporters gathered outside, their cameras poised, their voices buzzing with speculation. Inside, the air was heavier. The trial had drawn a crowd that spilled into the corridors, everyone eager, some fearful, to hear the truth of what had happened that terrible night. Inside courtroom 6B, wooden benches groaned under the weight of bodies pressed close together. Suits rustled, notebooks flipped, and pens scratched hurriedly as journalists and court watchers settled into their seats. The murmur of conversation filled the air like static, a low hum of voices bouncing against the paneled walls and echoing faintly under the lofty ceiling. At the center of it all sat the defendant, a man in his late 30s with sharp features and cold eyes. His suit was pressed, his tie knotted neatly, but no amount of polish could wash away the shadows of suspicion clinging to him. He sat stiffly, flanked by his attorneys, staring forward as though he could will away the verdict before it came. His hands rested calmly on the table, but his knuckles betrayed him, whitening every time the prosecutor's gaze locked on him. Across the room, the prosecution team prepared their notes, flipping through highlighted pages of testimony, photographs, and reports. They knew today would be pivotal, but they also knew their key witness wasn't like the others. She was fragile, young, and had endured more than any child should. Convincing the jury would depend not on facts alone, but on whether she found her voice. And that was far from certain. Toward the back of the courtroom, tucked against her mother's side, the little girl sat quietly, her tiny frame almost swallowed by the wooden bench. She couldn't have been more than 7, though her large brown eyes carried a weight no child her age should bear. She clutched a stuffed bear, its fur worn thin, one button eye missing, and her fingers twisted at its ears in nervous circles. She hadn't spoken much since the night of the attack. Weeks of therapy had coaxed whispers from her, fragments of memory, but her fear ran deep. The courtroom was filled with strangers, their stares heavy, their expectations crushing. Beside her mother stroked her hair, whispering encouragements. "It's okay, baby. You're safe now." But the girl didn't answer. Her eyes flicked nervously to the front of the room where the defendant sat. Each time she glanced his way, her grip on the bear tightened. Near the witness stand, a German shepherd named Max lay curled at the feet of Officer Daniels. Max was no ordinary dog. He was a decorated canine, trained in search, rescue, and protection. His amber eyes scanned the room with steady calm, his presence both reassuring and commanding. Most saw him as a silent guard, a comfort for the witnesses called to testify. But for the little girl, he was more than that. Max had been there. The night everything changed. He had lunged, growled, and thrown himself between her and danger. Without him, the headlines outside might have been tragically different. She had clung to his fur that night, shaking and terrified, while officers swarmed the scene. In the weeks since, she hadn't spoken much to therapists, or her mother, or even to herself in whispers. But when she saw Max, something softened. Something in her seemed to believe she wasn't alone. The bailiff's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "All rise." The chatter ceased instantly. Wooden benches scraped against the floor as everyone stood. Judge Reynolds entered, his black robe flowing as he climbed to the bench. He was a man known for fairness, with a stern jaw and eyes that carried decades of wisdom from cases past. But even he seemed to acknowledge the heaviness in the air today. He glanced briefly toward the child, his expression softening, before turning his attention to the case file before him. "You may be seated." The crowd lowered into their seats, and the trial resumed. The prosecution began, laying out their opening words with measured calm. They spoke of the crime, of evidence, of trauma endured. Their words painted a picture grim enough to silence even the most restless listeners. But everyone in that room knew the real moment. The decisive one would come when the girl was asked to speak. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, lips curved into something between a smile and a smirk. He didn't believe the child would hold up under pressure. He didn't believe her words could sway a jury. To him, she was a fragile little girl, too timid, too broken to stand against his client. His strategy depended on her silence. But silence was about to become his undoing. The prosecutor shifted, glancing toward the girl and her mother. The time had come. A hush fell over the courtroom as the bailiff stepped forward. Would the witness please approach the stand? The girl's mother whispered encouragement, urging her to rise. The child shook her head, burying her face briefly in the bear's fur. Her small shoulders trembled, her knees locked. She didn't want to move. She didn't want all those eyes staring at her. The room seemed too big, the silence too heavy, the distance to the stand too far. But then, something unexpected happened. Max stirred. His ears perked up, his head lifting as if he sensed her fear. With slow, deliberate steps, he rose from his spot and padded softly across the wooden floor. Every head turned. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The bailiff moved to intercept, but Judge Reynolds raised his hand. "Let him be," the judge said firmly, his eyes thoughtful. Max stopped right beside the little girl. He didn't bark, didn't nudge, didn't demand attention. He simply sat tall, close enough for her to feel the warmth of his body. His steady presence seemed to anchor her in place, like a lighthouse against crashing waves. The girl looked down at him, her trembling slowing. Her hand reached out hesitantly, brushing against his ear. For the first time since stepping foot in the courtroom, her lips moved. The mother's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "You can do this, sweetheart. He's here with you." And slowly, with Max at her side, the little girl stood. Gasps echoed faintly as she stepped forward, her bear clutched in one hand, her other resting lightly against Max's fur. Together, they walked toward the witness stand, each small step carrying a weight far heavier than her years. The crowd leaned forward, holding its breath. The defendant's smirk faltered. The jurors sat straighter, their pens paused. "Judge." Reynolds adjusted his glasses, eyes narrowing with interest. It wasn't just a little girl walking to the stand. It was a child who had found her courage, not in the silence of her own fear, but in the steady presence of a loyal companion. And though no one yet knew what she would say, one thing was clear. This testimony would not be ordinary. The silence that filled the courtroom was unlike any other. It wasn't awkward, nor was it empty. It was charged like the still air before a storm, when you know lightning is about to strike. And all of it began with the quiet, deliberate steps of a German shepherd named Max. The wooden floorboards groaned under the soft tread of tiny shoes as the little girl, guided by Max's silent strength, made her way toward the witness stand. Each step seemed monumental, as if she were crossing an ocean rather than the short distance between the benches and the stand. The stuffed bear dangled from her hand, worn fur brushing against her leg. The German shepherd matched her pace, never straying an inch, his large frame shielding her from the piercing eyes fixed on her fragile figure. The courtroom was spellbound. No one shifted. No one whispered. It was as though time itself slowed, forcing everyone to witness the bravery unfolding before them. Her mother clasped her hands tightly in her lap, lips moving in whispered prayers. She knew how much courage it took for her daughter to stand, let alone walk into the center of a room filled with strangers. For weeks, therapists had struggled to draw out more than fragments. Every attempt at testimony had ended in tears, silence, or both. But today, something was different. Today, Max was here. The judge, seated high above, leaned forward. His eyes softened as he watched the child approach. Though his years on the bench had hardened him to countless tragedies, there was something about this moment that cut through his composure. It wasn't the sight of another young victim. It was the unmistakable resilience behind those trembling steps. When the girl reached the stand, the bailiff moved to assist her, but she shook her head ever so slightly. She wanted to do this herself. Max positioned himself at the base of the stand, lying down with a quiet sigh, his amber eyes fixed upward as though watching over her. The judge cleared his throat gently. "Raise your right hand, please." Her hand shot up awkwardly. The stuffed bear still clutched in her left. The courtroom stilled further, watching as she recited the oath in a wavering but determined voice. By the time she whispered, "I do," the atmosphere had shifted. What had begun as doubt now carried a glimmer of something stronger hope. The prosecutor approached slowly, his movements careful, as if not to frighten her. He crouched slightly to meet her eye level. "Good morning, sweetheart. Do you remember me?" The girl nodded faintly. "You're very brave to be here," he said gently. "We don't need you to say anything scary. Just tell us what you remember." "Can you do that?" Her fingers twisted around the bear's ear, knuckles white. For a moment, silence hovered, threatening to swallow her words. Then she glanced down at Max. The dog hadn't moved, but his presence seemed to steady her. She took a deep breath and nodded. "Can you tell us your name?" the prosecutor asked. "Emily," she whispered, barely audible. The judge leaned forward. "Could you say it a little louder, please?" She looked down, cheeks flushing. "Pink, Emily," she repeated, this time strong enough for the jury to hear. A ripple of quiet relief swept across the courtroom. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the table. He masked his concern with an air of boredom, but the faint tightening of his jaw betrayed his unease. He had banked on the girl freezing, her silence breaking the prosecution's case. Yet here she was, speaking, carried by the strange strength of a dog who seemed to know exactly when she needed him. "Emily," the prosecutor continued, his tone patient and kind. "Do you remember the night the police came to help you?" Her small hands trembled again. She hugged the bear tighter and cast another glance toward Max. The dog shifted his head slightly, as though encouraging her. "Yes," she whispered. "Do you remember what happened before they came?" Emily hesitated, tears brimming in her eyes. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Then, instead of looking at the prosecutor, she pointed straight at Max. "He knows," she said, her voice carrying louder than anyone expected. The words struck the room like a lightning bolt. Gasps erupted from the benches. Jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even the stenographer's hands froze over the keys for a split second before resuming. The prosecutor blinked, startled, then crouched lower. "What do you mean, Emily? What does Max know?" Emily's gaze never wavered from the German shepherd. Her lips trembled, but her words were clear. He was there. The defense attorney shot up, slamming his hand on the table. "Objection! This is absurd. The witness is a child, attributing thoughts to an animal. This is not admissible testimony." Judge Reynolds banged his gavel, his face stern. "Sit down, counselor. The jury will decide what to make of her words. Continue." The prosecutor nodded gratefully, turning back to Emily. "Sweetheart, can you tell us what you mean by 'he was there'?" Emily's small shoulders rose and fell with a shaky breath. Her eyes glistened as tears spilled down her cheeks. "The bad man came. He tried to hurt me. But Max stopped him." The silence that followed was unlike any before. It wasn't the hush of formality. It was raw, heavy, charged with disbelief and emotion. The defense attorney stammered. To his feet again. She's clearly been coached, but the prosecutor cut him off, his voice sharp. Objection to counsel's interruption. Let the child finish. Judge Reynolds gave the defense a warning glare. One more outburst and you'll be held in contempt. Sit down. The defense attorney slumped back into his chair, his face pale. Meanwhile, Emily continued. He barked and jumped. He pushed the man down. And the police came. She rubbed her eyes with her sleeve, her voice cracking but steady. Max saved me. Tears welled in several jurors' eyes. A woman in the gallery pressed a hand to her mouth, muffling a sob. Even the prosecutor had to pause, collecting himself before moving on. Emily, he said softly, did anyone tell you what Max did that night? She shook her head firmly. I remember, I saw it. The significance was clear. The child hadn't been coached. Her words matched police reports that hadn't been shared with her. She was recounting her memory, raw and unfiltered. And she was doing it with the unshakable conviction of someone who knew she was safe only because of the dog at her side. Max remained motionless, but his gaze never left her. It was as though he understood the weight of her words, as though his very stillness was proof of his quiet heroism. The prosecutor straightened, addressing the jury. You've heard it. From her own mouth. Not from police reports, not from speculation. This child saw with her own eyes what happened. And the only reason she can stand here today is because of that dog. The defense attorney scrambled through his notes, searching for a rebuttal that wouldn't sound hollow. But the tide in the room had shifted. He could feel it pressing against him like a current too strong to fight. The jurors leaned forward, their pens forgotten. Every eye remained on Emily, who, despite her trembling hands and tear-streaked cheeks, sat taller than before. She had spoken her truth, and in doing so, she had pierced the silence the defense had counted on. The judge let the moment linger, his gavel untouched. He wasn't just presiding over testimony, he was witnessing courage in its purest form. And as Emily glanced once more at Max, whispering softly, "He's my hero," there wasn't a soul in that courtroom who doubted her. The silence that followed wasn't skeptical anymore. It was reverent. The weight of Emily's last words still clung to the air like smoke after a fire. He knows. The phrase echoed in the courtroom, bouncing from wall to wall, resonating in the minds of everyone present. No one moved. Even the scratch of the stenographer's keys had paused for a heartbeat before resuming, as if the entire room needed time to process what had just been said. The jury leaned forward, their faces unreadable but undeniably alert. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, knowing this was the kind of moment that headlines were born from. On the prosecution's bench, jaws were tight, eyes wide, and shoulders tensed. This wasn't the predictable line of testimony they had prepared for, but it might be far more powerful than anything they had planned. At the defense table, however, panic flickered behind carefully composed expressions. The lead defense attorney, a tall man with slicked-back hair and a reputation for ruthless cross-examinations, tapped his pen rapidly against his notes. He knew the power of moments like this. Jurors didn't always remember legal jargon, but they remembered the unexpected, the emotional, the human. And this was unforgettable. He couldn't let it stand unchallenged. The judge broke the silence first. "Proceed," he said, his voice deep but measured. The prosecutor crouched again, his voice gentle as he spoke to Emily. "Sweetheart, you said Max knows. Can you tell us what you mean by that?" Emily's eyes darted briefly toward the defendant. The man sat motionless, though his jaw had tightened noticeably. Then she turned back to the dog, lying at the base of the stand. Max hadn't moved, but his steady presence anchored her like a tether in a storm. "He saw everything," she whispered. Her words were trembling but clear, ringing through the hushed room. "He was there when the bad man tried to grab me. Max stopped him. He knows. Gasps rippled through the benches. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth, eyes brimming with tears. One juror blinked rapidly, fighting to keep composure. The prosecutor hesitated, aware of the fragility of the moment. He couldn't press too hard, but he needed her words on record. "Emily," he asked softly, "when you say he stopped the bad man, what do you remember?" Emily's fingers twisted tighter around her bear. Her lips trembled, but when she glanced down again at Max, her voice steadied. "He barked. He jumped. He made the man fall down. Then the police came." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, voices colliding like waves. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor," he thundered, slamming his hand on the table. "This is hearsay of the worst kind. A witness is a child, contributing memory and cognition to an animal. This is fantasy, not testimony." Judge Reynolds banged his gavel, silencing the room. His gaze hardened. "Objection overruled. The jury will determine how to weigh her words." "Sit down, counselor." The defense attorney clenched his jaw, lowering himself back into his seat with visible reluctance. His knuckles whitened as he gripped his pen, snapping it with a sharp crack that drew a few startled glances. The prosecutor, unfazed, turned back to Emily. "Sweetheart, has anyone told you what Max did that night?" She shook her head firmly. "I remember. He kept me safe." Her small, trembling voice carried more weight than stacks of police reports. Because it wasn't just about facts. It was about truth spoken through innocence. The prosecutor stood slowly, addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not imagination. This is not coaching. This child has just described, in her own words, the exact sequence of events corroborated in the police report. And she has done so without hesitation because she remembers. And because she knows she is safe." He gestured toward Max. "And the reason she is able to speak with such courage today is sitting right there." Every head turned toward the German shepherd. Max lay still, ears perked, eyes calm and unblinking, as though absorbing the weight of the room without flinching. The defense attorney stood abruptly. "Your Honor, permission to cross-examine." Judge Reynolds nodded. "Proceed." The defense attorney approached slowly, deliberately, his polished shoes echoing on the wood. He towered over the stand, his sharp suit and sharp voice intended to intimidate. But Emily barely looked at him. Her gaze flicked to Max, then back to her bear. "Emily," he began, his tone smooth but edged, "you said Max knows. But dogs don't think the way people do they? They don't talk, they don't testify. Isn't it true that you've been told things about that night by your mother, by the police, by others?" Emily frowned, clutching her bear tighter. "No, I remember." The attorney leaned closer. "You remember, or you were told?" Her eyes glistened, but her voice, though soft, was steady. "I remember." He smirked faintly. "Children your age sometimes imagine things, don't they? Like dreams or stories." Before she could answer, Max shifted slightly, his claws clicking softly against the floor. The sound was subtle, but it made Emily sit taller. Her trembling stopped. She shook her head. It wasn't a dream. It was real. The attorney's smirk faltered. From the bench, Judge Reynolds studied the girl, his hand hovering over the gavel. The jury's eyes were glued to her, their expressions tightening with every question. The defense attorney could feel the moment slipping from his control, but he pressed on. "Emily," he said, his voice firm now, "you're very young. You're scared. Isn't it possible that what you remember is just what you want to believe? That this dog is your comfort, and you've confused that with reality?" Emily's small voice rose, sharp enough to slice through the silence. "No, he saved me." The courtroom froze. Her words rang with conviction, that no lawyer, no adult, no strategy could have manufactured. The defense attorney staggered, slightly, his mouth opening but no words coming out. For a man who prided himself on control, he suddenly had none. The judge's gavel cracked down once more. "That's enough, counselor. Return to your seat." The defense attorney's face burned red as he turned, retreating stiffly to his table. His client shot him a venomous glare, but the damage was already done. Emily sat straighter now, her eyes still wet with tears, but glowing with something. Stronger resolve. Her hand dropped from the bear to rest on the wooden rail of the stand. Below her, Max's tail thumped softly once against the floor, a quiet signal of support only she seemed to notice. The prosecutor stepped forward once more, his voice softer now. "Emily, do you feel safe right now?" She looked down at Max, then back up. "Yes, because he's here." That was it, the unshakable truth, spoken simply. The courtroom sat in stunned silence, the weight of a child's courage pressing down on every soul in the room. For the first time, even the defendant shifted uncomfortably, his mask of indifference cracking as sweat beaded along his brow. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was electric. And in that silence, everyone knew the words of a little girl had just changed everything. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the chamber, but even that sound seemed muted against the lingering force of Emily's words. "I remember. He saved me." The phrase hung in the air like a banner of truth no cross-examination could. Tear down, the jurors sat riveted, some with brows furrowed in concentration, others with eyes softening as if moved by something beyond the letter of the law. They weren't just weighing evidence anymore. They were feeling it. The prosecutor knew it. The defense knew it. The judge, too, leaned back in his chair, his face thoughtful, aware of the seismic shift that had just taken place. Trials turned. On moments like this, sudden flashes where the fog cleared and the human heart cut through the technicalities. Emily clutched her stuffed bear again, her tiny knuckles white, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. The strain of testifying was etched into her small shoulders, but there was something undeniable in her posture now. She wasn't just a frightened child anymore. She was a survivor who had found her voice. Max remained perfectly still at her feet, as if sensing the fragile balance of the room. His eyes stayed locked on her, radiating the kind of silent reassurance only he could provide. The jurors noticed. So did the gallery. And though no one said it aloud, everyone understood this was no ordinary dog. The prosecutor rose slowly, careful not to shatter the delicate energy Emily had created. He addressed the judge first. "Your Honor, I have no further questions for this witness. Her testimony speaks for itself." Judge Reynolds nodded. "The witness may step down." But Emily didn't move. Her wide eyes turned to the judge, then to the prosecutor. "Can Max come with me?" she whispered, her voice trembling but audible in the hushed room. A ripple of emotion swept through the gallery, some muffled gasps, a soft chuckle, a few sniffles quickly stifled. The judge's stern expression softened for the briefest moment. "Yes, Emily, he may accompany you." At that, Max rose gracefully to his feet. The child slid down from the witness chair, her hand finding the thick fur at his neck. Together, they walked across the courtroom, a pair bound by invisible threads of courage and trust. Every step they took seemed to reverberate through the room like the toll of a bell. When the door closed behind them, silence followed, long, heavy, almost reverent. It was the defense attorney who broke it, slamming his notebook shut with unnecessary force. "Your Honor, I move to strike that testimony. It is unreliable, prejudicial." And the judge's gavel came down again. "Motion denied. Sit down, counselor." The attorney bristled, his face taut with frustration. He leaned toward his client, whispering furiously, but the defendant's expression had hardened into something unreadable. He knew, just as everyone else did, that the tide had turned. The prosecutor wasted no time. The state calls Detective Harris to the stand. A tall, broad-shouldered man in uniform strode forward, his presence commanding but calm. He had been there that night, the night Max lunged into action, dragging a grown man to the ground to protect a terrified child. His testimony, detailed and methodical, painted the scene Emily had just described in haunting detail. "Detective Harris," the prosecutor asked, "in your professional opinion, did the canine's actions directly prevent harm to the child?" "Yes," the detective answered without hesitation. Max's intervention stopped the abduction in progress. Without him, the outcome could have been very different. As he spoke, jurors scribbled notes, their pens scratching quickly across their pads. Some nodded almost imperceptibly, connecting his testimony to Emily's words. The defense attorney rose for cross-examination, his tone sharp. "Detective, are you seriously suggesting that a dog can testify to a crime?" "No," Harris said coolly. "I'm saying that his actions spoke louder than words." A faint murmur rippled across the gallery, half-suppressed laughter mixed with admiration. The defense attorney's jaw tightened. The prosecutor leaned into the momentum. "Detective, did Max demonstrate behavior consistent with recognizing the defendant during subsequent lineups?" "Yes. Each time he reacted immediately and aggressively toward the defendant." "Consistently." The jurors exchanged glances. The picture forming in their minds was clear, and it wasn't one the defense could easily smear with technicalities. By the time Harris stepped down, the courtroom's energy had shifted entirely. The prosecution had woven a thread from Emily's fragile testimony to hard police evidence, tying it together with Max at the center. The defense scrambled, calling expert witnesses, psychologists, and canine behaviorists in an attempt to discredit what had just unfolded. One insisted that dogs often misinterpret commands. Another claimed that child witnesses could be suggestible. But the more they tried to unravel the thread, the more tangled they became. Because in the jurors' minds, they weren't debating psychology. They were picturing a brave little girl, clutching a stuffed bear and whispering, "He saved me." The defendant sat rigid, his eyes flickering with barely concealed anger. His confidence, once unshakable, had begun to crack. He avoided looking toward the jury, avoided looking at the empty chair where Emily had sat. And when Max was quietly led back into the courtroom, later that afternoon settling once again by his handler's side, the defendant's jaw clenched visibly. The jurors noticed. The judge called a recess, his gavel striking once more. But even as the crowd shuffled out, the hum of conversation rising like a wave, one thing was clear to everyone who had witnessed it. This was no longer just a trial. It was a battle between truth and denial, courage and cruelty, innocence and manipulation. And the truth had just found its most unlikely champion in the form of a child and her dog. When the jury filed out for the break, their faces revealed nothing, yet their silence spoke volumes. Reporters flooded the courthouse steps, already drafting headlines that would capture the day's drama. Families watching from the gallery clutched one another, whispering prayers or sharing tears. Inside, the defense team regrouped, huddling in tense whispers, their earlier arrogance replaced with urgency. The prosecutor, meanwhile, sat calmly, jotting notes, but his eyes betrayed a quiet fire. Because he knew the tide of justice had shifted. And it had shifted the moment a little girl pointed at a dog and said two words that silenced an entire courtroom. "He knows." The afternoon sun filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting pale beams across the polished wooden floor. Dust motes floated in the golden light, suspended as if even time itself was holding its breath. The jury filed back into the box after recess, their faces unreadable masks of composure, yet every heart in the room knew the atmosphere had shifted. The defense team sat in uneasy silence. Their once confident whispers had hardened into tense arguments, their papers shuffled with frantic energy. The lead defense attorney, Mr. Callahan, tried to smooth his tie with steady hands, but the motion betrayed his nerves. His strategy, the one built on doubt and dismissal, was crumbling. Emily's testimony, fragile yet piercing, had slipped past the fortress of legal maneuvering. And Max, the silent sentinel at her side, had done what no expert witness could. He had made the truth undeniable. Still, Callahan wasn't ready to surrender. He had one card left to play. "Your Honor," he began, rising to his feet with a practiced show of authority. "The defense requests permission to introduce new evidence, records and testimony that challenge the credibility of the prosecution's narrative." A ripple of surprise coursed through the courtroom. It was unusual, dangerously so, for the defense to produce new material this late in the trial. The prosecutor, Mr. Andrews, immediately rose in protest. "Objection. This is a blatant attempt to derail the proceedings. We've had weeks to examine discovery springing this. Now is an abuse of process." Judge Reynolds frowned, his gavel hovering just above the block. His eyes shifted between the attorneys, weighing fairness against the risk of spectacle. Finally, he spoke in a measured tone. "Bring your materials forward, counselor. We will determine admissibility before the jury hears anything further." The bailiff collected a folder from Callahan's table and handed it to the bench. The room fell into an uneasy silence as the judge flipped through its contents. His brow furrowed, his lips pressing into a tight line. After several minutes, he set the folder down with deliberate care. "These records appear incomplete," he said sternly. "Nonetheless, I will allow a limited presentation. But tread carefully, Mr. Callahan. This court will not tolerate theatrics." Callahan gave a short nod, masking his relief. He turned toward the jury, his voice smooth, almost oily. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've been told is only half the story. The child's testimony, while emotional, cannot substitute for fact. Today, we reveal inconsistencies that the prosecution has conveniently ignored." The gallery leaned forward, anticipation crackling in the air. Callahan called his first witness, a psychologist who specialized in child memory. She walked briskly to the stand, her professional poise unshaken. "Doctor," Callahan began, "is it common for children under the age of 10 to confuse details of traumatic events?" "Yes," she replied, her tone clinical. "Children are highly suggestible. They may incorporate external cues into their memories, believing them to be real." Callahan pressed further. "So, it is entirely possible that Emily's testimony was shaped, perhaps unintentionally, by therapy sessions, or even by seeing the defendant in court, correct?" The psychologist nodded. "Yes, it's within the realm of possibility." The defense attorney allowed the words to linger, letting doubt creep into the corners of the jury's minds. But when the prosecutor rose for cross-examination, his voice carried quiet steel. "Doctor, are you aware that the child's testimony aligned precisely with physical evidence and the statements of trained officers?" "Yes," she admitted cautiously. "And would you also agree," Andrews continued, "that while children can be suggestible, they are also capable of recalling events with remarkable accuracy when the trauma is vivid enough?" The psychologist hesitated. "That is true." Andrews delivered the final blow. "Then what we have here is not suggestion, it is corroboration." "Thank you, doctor." "No further questions." The psychologist stepped down, her credibility intact, but her testimony diminished. Undeterred, Callahan moved to his second tactic. He introduced grainy security footage from a convenience store near the crime scene. The video, shaky and poorly lit, appeared to show a man resembling the defendant entering the store at the approximate time of the incident. "This proves," Callahan declared, "that my client was elsewhere. He was buying groceries, not committing a crime." The jury leaned forward, squinting at the blurry images on the screen. At first glance, the figure did resemble the defendant, but the prosecution was ready. Andrews stood calmly. "Your Honor, we request to pause the footage at timestamp 2142. The bailiff complied. The frozen frame revealed a detail most had missed. A man's left wrist bore a distinctive tattoo, an intricate dragon winding around his forearm. The defendant, seated stiffly at the defense table, had no such mark. His suit sleeves slid back just enough to reveal bare skin. Gasps erupted from the gallery. The defense attorney's face flushed crimson. "Objection," he barked. "This is circumstantial." "Overruled," Judge Reynolds said firmly. "The jury will disregard this footage as evidence of alibi." The defense's last card had collapsed under its own weight. As murmurs filled the room, Max stirred again. He rose from his position near Officer Daniels and padded toward the jury box, his nails clicking softly against the wooden floor. He stopped midway, his gaze steady on the defendant. His ears pricked, his body tense, not aggressive, but alert, as if recognizing something familiar. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't trained behavior. It was instinct. The jurors saw it. So did the spectators. And though no words were spoken, the silent message rang louder than any argument. The dog remembered. The judge, noting the charged atmosphere, called for order. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will adjourn for the day. Court resumes at 9 a.m. tomorrow." His gavel struck once, sharp and final. As the jury filed out, their expressions remained neutral, but their glances toward Max betrayed something deeper. They weren't just processing evidence, they were processing conviction. Emily, who had been waiting quietly with her mother in a nearby chamber, rushed forward when the recess was called. She dropped to her knees, wrapping her small arms around Max's neck. He leaned into her, his tail wagging slowly, his amber eyes softening. The child whispered into his ear, though only her mother caught the words. "You're my hero." In that moment, the courtroom, its battles of law and logic, its clashing of pride and power faded into the background. What remained was a bond unshakable, untainted by strategy. A child who had found courage in the most unlikely place, and a dog who had become more than a guardian. And though the trial was far from over, everyone in that room sensed it. The truth had teeth, and it wasn't going to let go. Morning light streamed through the courthouse windows like pale ribbons of gold, illuminating dust particles that swirled lazily in the air. The benches creaked as people filed in, their whispers buzzing with anticipation. Reporters crowded near the entrance, pens ready, cameras flashing. Day 6 of the trial was about to begin, and by now, the case had captured not just the city's attention, but the nation's. The stakes were higher than ever. Emily's fragile but powerful testimony still echoed in every mind. The defense's failed attempts to discredit her had left the jury uneasy, and Max's instinctive recognition of the defendant had left an indelible mark. Yet the trial wasn't finished. The defense still had a chance, if they could uncover something, anything, that cast doubt. Inside the courtroom, the defendant sat stiffly at the table, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between his lawyers. And the jury box. He wore the same polished suit, the same carefully practiced air of composure, but cracks had formed in his mask. He drummed his fingers against the wood, his movements sharp and restless. Beside him, Callahan, the lead defense attorney, shuffled through papers with the intensity of a drowning man searching for a rope. His voice, when he finally stood, was loud enough to startle the silence. "Your Honor, the defense calls Officer Raymond Blake to the stand." The name rippled through the courtroom. Blake had been one of the first responders the night of the attempted abduction. His absence from the witness list until now was conspicuous, and the prosecutor's head snapped up in surprise. Judge Reynolds narrowed his eyes. "Proceed." Blake entered, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. He swore his oath and settled into the witness chair. His posture was rigid, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Callahan wasted no time. "Officer Blake, on the night in question, were you present when the defendant was detained?" "Yes." "And did you personally witness the alleged assault on the child?" "No," Blake replied evenly. "I arrived seconds after," Callahan pounced. "So you cannot say, with certainty, that my client committed the crime?" A murmur rippled through the jury box. Blake's words hadn't exonerated the defendant, but they had introduced a sliver of doubt. The prosecutor rose, his tone calm. "Officer Blake, when you arrived, what did you see?" Blake's eyes flickered, just for a moment, before he answered. The child was clinging to the canine. The defendant was restrained by 2 officers. He was shouting, resisting. "And did you later examine the area?" Andrews pressed. "Yes, there were signs of struggle scuff marks, a broken toy, drag marks in the dirt." Andrews nodded. "So while you didn't see the assault begin, you witnessed its aftermath?" "Yes," Blake admitted reluctantly. The prosecutor's eyes sharpened. "And did Max the K-9 immediately identify the defendant?" A pause. "Yes." The defense attorney objected, but the damage was done. Blake's testimony reinforced Emily's story, rather than unraveling it. Still, something about Blake's hesitation lingered. His words were factual, but his tone carried weight. He wasn't speaking aloud. Andrews caught it, the judge noticed it, and even the jury shifted uneasily. When Blake stepped down, the prosecution called its next witness, a forensic technician. She testified about fibers found on Emily's clothing, fibers that matched the interior of the defendant's car. The connection was damning, tightening the net around him. The defense countered with an alternative theory. They suggested contamination, that the fibers had been transferred in the chaos of the police response. But the explanation felt thin, stretched, and the jurors didn't hide their skepticism. Then, just as the day seemed ready to close, the unexpected happened. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, his voice grave. "Before we adjourn, there is a matter the court must address. The prosecution has submitted a sealed motion regarding additional evidence discovered late yesterday evening. I have reviewed it. Given its relevance, it will be admitted tomorrow." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously. The defense demanded to know what the evidence was, but the judge raised his gavel. "You'll see it presented in due course. Court is adjourned." The gavel cracked down, but the echoes were drowned by the buzz of speculation. Emily, waiting with her mother in a private chamber, peeked out nervously as people poured into the hall. She didn't understand sealed motions or forensic fibers, but she understood one thing. The trial wasn't over, and the man who had frightened her was still fighting to escape justice. She pressed her stuffed bear against her chest, her small hand buried in Max's fur. Her mother crouched down, smoothing Emily's hair. "You were so brave," she whispered. "You've done your part." But Emily shook her head. "It's not finished. Max knows. He wants to finish it." The German shepherd sat tall beside her, his ears pricked, his amber eyes unblinking. It was as if he understood every word. Meanwhile, in the defense's chamber, panic had begun to creep in. Callahan's team argued in harsh whispers, their voices sharp with frustration. "If that sealed evidence is what I think it is, we're finished," one muttered. The defendant slammed his fist on the table, his composure unraveling. "You said she wouldn't talk. You said the dog couldn't matter." His voice was low, but venomous. Callahan pressed his palms against the table, trying to regain control. We still have a chance. If we can shake the jury tomorrow, if we can convince them this new evidence is flawed. But even he didn't believe it anymore. That night, the courthouse stood empty, its echoing halls silent under the glow of security lights. Yet the weight of the day lingered like a storm. On the horizon, tomorrow would bring revelations no one was prepared for. Emily slept fitfully in her bed, her bear tucked under her chin, Max curled faithfully on the floor beside her. In her dreams, she relived the night of terror, but each time, the dog appeared, pulling her back from the darkness. In the defendant's cell, the man lay awake, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, fear gnawed at him, not fear of justice, but fear of being exposed. He knew what evidence might come tomorrow. And if it did, no lawyer, no strategy, no lie would save him. And so, as dawn crept closer, the trial neared its breaking point. Because in a battle between silence and truth, shadows and light, the shadows were running out of places to hide. The courthouse steps were packed long before sunrise. Reporters jostled for position, their microphones raised, their voices cutting through the cool morning air. Day 7 of the trial, one announced breathlessly, and the nation waits to see what new evidence will be revealed. Inside, the courtroom buzzed like a hive. Spectators whispered, their voices sharp with curiosity. The jurors filed in, each expression carefully blank, though their eyes betrayed restless anticipation. Even Judge Reynolds, normally stoic, adjusted his glasses twice before raising the gavel. Court is now in session. The hush was immediate. The sealed evidence motioned by the prosecution yesterday will now be presented, the judge declared. He nodded toward Andrews, the prosecutor, who rose slowly, his case file tucked under one arm. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Andrews began, his voice steady. Yesterday, forensic specialists concluded an analysis of DNA samples collected from the defendant's vehicle. Those results have returned. They confirm this presence of Emily Carter's blood on the interior upholstery of the rear seat. Gasps cut through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously, pens scratching like fire. The defendant's face drained of color. Andrews continued, his tone sharpening. Not only that, but fibers from Emily's stuffed bear, her most cherished possession, were also discovered embedded in the fabric of that seat. These findings are irrefutable. They place the child inside the defendant's vehicle at the time of the crime. The jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances. Some clutched their pens tighter. Others leaned back, absorbing the weight of the revelation. The defense attorney, Callahan, leapt to his feet. Objection. This is prejudicial and incomplete. We haven't had sufficient time to. Overruled, Judge Reynolds said firmly. The evidence is admissible. The defendant slammed, his fist against the table, his composure unraveling. The bailiff stepped forward immediately, but the judge's sharp look silenced further outburst. The prosecutor pressed on, unflinching. The defense has attempted to discredit a child's testimony, to cast doubt upon a trained canine's instincts, and to dismiss physical evidence as coincidence. But science does not bend to convenience. This is not speculation. This is fact. He turned deliberately toward the jury, his eyes locking with theirs. And it tells a story that Emily herself was too young to fully put into words. The defendant took her. And had Max not intervened, the outcome might have been unspeakable. The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time in the trial, the jury wasn't just weighing arguments. They were staring directly at truth that could not be unraveled. But the defense wasn't finished. Callahan adjusted his tie with trembling fingers. Your Honor, he said, forcing authority into his tone. The defense requests that this evidence be dismissed as contaminated. The investigation was sloppy chain of custody may have been compromised. Andrews countered instantly. The evidence was sealed, logged, and verified independently by 2 separate labs. Chain of custody is intact. The judge leaned forward, his gavel ready. Mr. Callahan, unless you can produce proof of contamination, the evidence stands. The defense attorney faltered, flipping desperately through his notes. But there was nothing. No loophole, no technicality. Just silence. The defendant leaned in, hissing furiously at his lawyer. His eyes burned with desperation. His mask of composure shattered. For the first time, the jury saw him as he truly was not, a man wrongly accused, but a predator cornered by the weight of his own actions. Then came the breaking point. The prosecution requested permission to recall Detective Harris. When he took the stand, his testimony was calm but decisive. He explained how Max had led officers directly to the defendant's vehicle that night, barking furiously, scratching at the doors until they forced it open. Inside, they had found the stuffed bear. "Detective," Andrews asked, his voice resonant, "in your professional opinion, what does this tell you?" Harris didn't hesitate. "It tells me the child was inside that car. It tells me Max was right." The words landed with the finality of a gavel strike. The jurors sat in stunned silence. A few shifted uncomfortably. Others scribbled frantic notes, but no one looked toward the defense table. Their eyes were locked on Harris, on Andrews, or on Max himself, who sat at attention, ears pricked, gaze steady, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Emily, seated with her mother at the back, pressed her bear tightly to her chest. She whispered into its worn fur, "They know now, Max. They all know." Her mother kissed the top of her head, tears glistening in her eyes. The defense's cross-examination was feeble, a shadow of its earlier aggression. Callahan's voice wavered as he tried to cast doubt, but the jurors weren't swayed. The tide had turned too far. The judge finally raised his gavel. "Court will adjourn until tomorrow morning, when closing arguments will be heard." The gavel struck. The sound was like thunder. The room erupted, reporters rushing for the exits, spectators buzzing, the defendant shouting furiously at his attorney. The bailiff restrained him quickly, his voice sharp. "Order!" But in the chaos, one moment stood still. Max rose and walked to Emily, pressing his head gently against her small shoulder. She buried her face into his fur, her tears wetting his coat. The dog stood unmoving, a silent protector, as if reminding her that the storm outside could not touch the bond they had forged. And though the trial wasn't yet over, the verdict seemed to hang already in the air, unspoken but undeniable. The truth had clawed its way to the surface, and it wasn't letting go. Tomorrow would bring the final words. Tomorrow would decide everything. But tonight, in that courthouse, heavy with shadows and whispers, the scales of justice had finally begun to tip. The courthouse was electric with anticipation as the final day of the trial began. Morning light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the polished wooden floors where countless feet had paced, shuffled, and raced over the past week. Reporters crowded the gallery, cameras clicking in rapid succession, capturing every tense moment. Families, witnesses, and spectators whispered quietly, each aware that today the story would reach its climax. The jury filed in, their faces neutral, yet their eyes glimmered with the intensity of careful observation. Every juror had witnessed Emily's testimony, Max's unwavering loyalty, and the avalanche of evidence that had followed. Now, it was time to hear the last words before the decision. Judge Reynolds called the courtroom to order, his gavel striking sharply. "We will begin with closing statements. Mr. Andrews, you may proceed." The prosecutor stood slowly, exuding calm authority. He turned first to the jury, his voice clear and resonant. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, This trial has been about more than legal technicalities. It has been about courage. It has been about truth. Emily Carter, a little girl no older than 3, spoke with bravery that none of us could command. She told us exactly what happened. She did not exaggerate. She did not imagine. She remembered. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the courtroom. The jurors were silent, their attention absolute. Max, the canine, did not need words to tell the truth. He acted instinctively, guided by loyalty and training. Together, they confirmed the events that the defendant cannot deny. The defendant attempted to abduct this child. Without Max, the outcome might have been unthinkable. He moved deliberately, making eye contact with each juror. This case is not complicated by ambiguity. The evidence is not disputed by facts. DNA analysis, fibers, eyewitness accounts, and the child's courageous testimony all point to one conclusion. The defendant is guilty, and justice demands that you hold him accountable. He returned to his seat, his calm conviction leaving. The courtroom hushed and heavy. The defense attorney rose, trying to summon composure. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to consider carefully before you allow emotion to cloud judgment. This trial has seen errors, uncertainties, and gaps in evidence. We cannot rely solely on the testimony of a child or a dog to convict a man of his life. Circumstantial evidence, assumptions, and fear should never outweigh reason. Doubt exists, reasonable doubt. Callahan's words were practiced, but they rang hollow in the charged atmosphere. The jurors shifted, uneasily, sensing the fragility. In the defense's argument, even the defendant slumped slightly in his chair, no longer projecting confidence. Judge Reynolds' voice finally cut through the tension. Members of the jury, you have heard all testimony and evidence. You will now deliberate and reach a verdict. As the jury filed out, the courtroom buzzed with nervous energy. Emily clutched her bear tightly, her small fingers buried in Max's fur. The dog remained at her side, a silent sentinel, his amber eyes calm yet alert. She whispered softly, though only her mother could hear. Be brave, Max. They'll see the truth. Outside, reporters pressed closer, their voices rising, but inside the courtroom, all attention centered on the little girl and the dog who had become symbols of courage and truth. Minutes turned into hours as the jury deliberated. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Spectators leaned forward, silently praying, speculating, imagining what might come next. Every scratch of a pen, every shuffle of paper seemed magnified. Finally, the doors opened. The jury filed in, their faces solemn. They took their seats, hands folded, eyes straight ahead. Judge Reynolds stood. Have you reached a verdict? The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a quiet authority, nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The judge gestured. Please read the verdict aloud. A hush fell that felt like the entire city had descended into the room. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, whispers rippled across the courtroom, like waves breaking on a shore. Tears glistened in the eyes of Emily's mother, and the spectators who had been swept into the emotional tide of the trial. The defendant's face paled, his lips pressed into a tight line. He lowered his head, defeated. His attorneys exchanged hurried, grim glances, the reality sinking in that no legal maneuver could erase what had been proven. Max rose from his position beside Emily. He nudged her gently, resting his head on her lap as if sharing in the victory. She hugged him tightly, burying her face in his fur, tears spilling freely. The prosecutor smiled quietly, watching the bond between child and dog. Andrews rose, addressing the courtroom. Justice has been served today because truth has a voice and courage has a witness. A child spoke bravely. A dog acted decisively. And together, They ensured that the right choice was made. Judge Reynolds banged his gavel for finality. This court is adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, Emily skipped lightly, still holding Max's leash. Reporters tried to catch her attention, but her mother guided her gently, knowing that today wasn't about headlines. It was about triumph, safety, and courage rewarded. Outside, sunlight spilled over the courthouse steps. A crowd waited to see the girl and the dog who had captured the hearts of everyone in the room. Cameras flashed, voices called out, but Emily walked calmly with Max at her side, small yet unshakable. One reporter whispered to another, "I've covered trials for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like this." Emily's mother knelt beside her daughter, hugging her tightly. "You are so brave," she whispered. "You told the truth, and you helped stop something terrible." Emily looked up at Max, amber eyes shining with trust and love. "We did it," she said simply. And Max, faithful as ever, nudged her shoulder with his snout, his tail wagging gently. He had done more than protect a child that night. He had guided the truth to light, standing as a silent hero in a world that often overlooked the smallest voices. The defendant was led away in handcuffs, his protests meaningless against the overwhelming weight of evidence, testimony, and courage. Justice, slow but inevitable, had prevailed. In the days that followed, Emily and Max became more than local heroes. They became symbols. Schools invited them to speak about bravery, newspapers chronicled their story, and families across the nation found inspiration in their bond. Yet for Emily, it was simple. The courtroom drama, the legal battles, the tense hours, they all faded in the presence of Max. The dog had kept her safe, given her courage, and reminded her that even the smallest voices can change the world. And in the quiet of their home, with the trial behind them, Emily whispered again to Max, "Thank you for being my hero." Max rested his head on her lap, eyes soft and unwavering, the silent answer clear. He always would be. The world had witnessed their story, but they didn't need anyone else to understand. They had each other. And sometimes that was more than enough.